want to be sensitive to the time we have. And we have an incredible panel today. We have Erika Karp, who is the, I think, CEO and founder of Cornerstone Capital and a contributor to the report. We have MaryAnne Howland, who is a leader in the whole world of equity, justice, and how to become an anti-racist, and a mentor and teacher of mine. We have Fred Alexander, who spent many, many years helping the B Corp process get established throughout the United States and really laying the legal foundation for that entire movement, and who is now off on his own, continuing to collaborate with them, but doing some fascinating work that he'll tell us about. And my boss, Tensie Whelan, who runs the Business Sustainability and Environmental Program at the Stern Business School at New York University. So we have some terrific speakers. I am Jeffrey Hollender. I am a co-founder and currently the CEO of the American Sustainable Business Council. And I was joined by a wonderful working group of, at times, up to 50 people who came from the NGO world, the world of academia, business leaders, and labor, all who collaborated in the development of this report. And of course, Maya, our incredible intern, who probably did most of the work and deserves most of the credit. So let me just get started with a brief introduction before we turn this over to our panelists. So I just want to sort of create a little bit of a framework by sharing some of the thoughts that we used in the introduction to the report. But since not everyone has read it, I want to repeat them. Starting with the COVID crisis and the continuing outrage of racism in America, what has been revealed is something that we have always known and suspected, but that our current system of capitalism is just not working for most of the American people, certainly some much less so than others. And as Steve Pearlstein, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, recently wrote in a very poignant manner, our economic system, in his opinion, has run off the moral rails, offending our sense of fairness, eroding our sense of community, poisoning our politics, and rewarding values that easily degenerate into greed and indifference. That sentiment was captured by a Just Capital Harris poll, where 75% of all Americans believe that our current system of capitalism no longer ensures the greater good of society, and only a minority of 29% believe it produces the kind of society we want for the next generation. This project had its initiation back in December of 2019, when the American Sustainable Business Council launched its work on creating an economic system that works for all at its Washington, D.C. summit. We then followed up the discussion that we had in that summit in March of 2020, when we launched our multi-stakeholder group, and the working group is listed in the document. And that working group was created to identify the most business-related public policy initiatives that are required to create this type of economy. And we started out with the notion that we would create a very, very narrow group of public policies. And as we dug into this and thought about the challenges we face from a more systemic perspective, what we realized was that there is a very complex and widespread system that we have to attack, and taking on one challenge at a time was not going to generate the kind of change that we were looking for. That's in part true because corporate management has focused so exclusively and obsessively on maximizing value for themselves and their shareholders, despite the fact that a growing chorus of finance experts argue that this narrow focus has come at way too great a cost to customers, employees, suppliers, community, the economy, and certainly our environment. If our economy is going to work for all, not just for CEOs, business management, and shareholders, business leaders have to implement simultaneously address the priorities for all those stakeholders. And that has received increasing discussion and conversation, but has not yet been brought to fruition. Back in August of 2019, the CEO members of the Business Roundtable, which represents more, but 181 of them signed a letter announcing their support for this new standard of stakeholder management. However, with this initiative barely off the ground, the New York Times declared big business pledged greater, gentler capitalism, but it's not happening during a pandemic. And what we saw from many of these companies that signed this wonderful letter was that when push came to shove, they resorted to continuing to pay out dividends to shareholders, pay themselves extravagant salaries and bonuses, instead of protecting the jobs of their workers who were now being laid off or put on furlough. Not an encouraging sign. To succeed, this transition to stakeholder management will require many changes, from broad public policy, which we'll talk about today, which prevents this obsessive erosion of value by focusing just on shareholders. It will also require real culture changes, particularly cultures at boards of publicly held companies that really are not used to thinking about and valuing all of their stakeholders. We've created this challenging situation we find ourselves in over the last 30 to 40 years, and these challenges will not be overcome overnight. We also realize that they're highly interrelated. You can't solve climate change without dealing with environmental justice. You can't solve environmental justice without addressing healthcare for all. And you can't address healthcare challenges without looking at the impact that hundreds of millions of dollars spent by the pharmaceutical industry on public policy and to influence public policy is happening. So let me just highlight a few of the public policies that hopefully we'll chat about today, and then I'll turn it over to our panel. But some of the public policies that we are really excited about include reparations for African Americans as recommended by Black Lives Matter, reparation also for Native Americans, mandatory diversity on corporate boards, which includes not just more diverse representation from minorities, but includes worker representation as well. And we believe that diversity on corporate boards will make them much more accountable to a broad group of stakeholders, improve financial performance, and challenge the culture that has developed some very troubling patterns. The adoption of full cost accounting to bring an end to many of the current accounting rules that encourage and allow businesses to externalize their negative impacts onto society and the environment. A wealth tax that has been championed by many people and who might have, and Thomas Piketty, who might have been the first one to conceive of this. We're also very excited about a progressive consumption tax, as is the case throughout most of the EU, establishing better corporate governance and fiduciary responsibility, ensuring equal access to capital. It's miserable when we look at the statistics of who gets capital and we look at the way people of color, women, and other underserved populations are treated. They don't have a seat at a table and they don't get access to the capital that's needed to start, run, expand, and grow their business. So those are just some of the things that we'll be touching upon. And I will be depending mostly on our wonderful panel to talk about these issues. Each panelist will talk for about 5 minutes to highlight some of these issues. And we will have plenty of time after that for you to ask us questions. So as questions appear, please put them in the Q&A, and we will touch on as many of those questions as we can. And since Rick Alexander is sitting at least virtually to my right, we'll start with Rick. Rick, take it away.
Thanks so much, Jeffrey. That was a great introduction. Off topic of my point, I just want to say, having listened to what you said and thinking about the connection between reparations, wealth tax, consumption tax, we're all working for just rules, but you can't just in the middle of the game come in and impose just rules. No, and Thomas Piketty says this, so somebody referred to, there's no revolution is successful if it doesn't involve a just redistribution of the unjust distribution that happened before. So I really appreciate the way you set this up. So thank you. I want to jump in to quickly talk about the contribution that I made together with my colleagues at the Shareholder Commons and B-Lab to ASBC's report. That we focused on corporate governance and corporate governance in the broad sense of how capital is governed both at institutional investors and at large companies that take money from those institutional investors, publicly traded companies, private equity company, venture capital companies, really large corporations. And I won't go into the details because you're not going to remember that. I just want to make the broad point what the issue we want to address is with legal changes. And the issue is, I think, this is a business group, and I think we're all pretty strong believers in capitalism and value of capitalism that it can bring to us. But what we're trying to address is the fact that capitalism, think back to Adam Smith and his baker, and he said, I get my bread from the baker, not because the baker likes me, but because he wanted to make money. And so he bought low, he innovated, grain and workers, and then he innovated, made a loaf of bread and sold it to me. And that's great, it created value. And that heuristic, profit, cost, dollars, works really well, and it's created lots of value. The problem is it's created a lot of problems, and as our society becomes more interdependent, and as we approach planetary boundaries with respect to carbon sinks, deforestation, fresh water, you name it, and as the power imbalances become greater, that heuristic is failing us. And we need to, and right now, like it or not, our rules of our financial system are really based around dollars and cents. And, we can have all the sort of ESG activism that we want, but right now, when you're a manager and you look at your P&L, $1 that you get from conserving energy and saving costs, and $1 that you get from buying a dirtier fuel and saving costs looks exactly the same. And we need to come up with a powerful rules of thumb that oppose that salience of the dollar. And so what we're about is trying to come up with a system of rules that make it easier for investors to push back and others as well, with guardrails, with very simple universalizable rules that preserve environmental and social systems. And we think the way to do that is to change the fiduciary duties at the level of both institutional investors and companies, and have those fiduciary duties have a system first orientation, so that it's great, to innovate and search for profit. But before you do that, you have to satisfy some rules of the game. For example, and I'm making these up, these aren't necessarily the rules, but you would want to enable a system where investors could say, we want every company to be on the way to paying a living wage based on this. And we want every company to have the median salary be no more than X, X over 100 of the CEO salary, whatever the rule is. But simple rules, not perfect rules. They might be criticized as one size fits all, but again, they have the salience to face up against the price rule, which is so clear. And we want investors to be able, based on the fact that most investors are diversified and their value comes from preserving social and environmental systems, we want investors to be able to easily impose those sorts of guardrails on the company they're invested in. And so we would change the fiduciary duties that govern corporations, that govern institutional investors, or at least refine them. And also we'd make it clear that the transparency, disclosure, either disclosure that goes from companies to their shareholders or disclosure that goes from institutional investors to their beneficiaries, addresses these sorts of things. So if you're a beneficiary of a pension fund, you would have information to understand whether your pension fund was working to preserve the climate system, working to preserve the freshwater system, working to preserve social systems, working to end racial injustices and inequalities. Because at the end of the day, those things are very important to you as a beneficiary. In addition to changing fiduciary duties and disclosure rules, we would want to adjust rules in the securities field and the antitrust field to make it clear that collective action by shareholders was not difficult. You know, right now, if a bunch of shareholders want to get together, they might get nervous that they have to do a bunch of complicated filings under the Williams Act, or that they become subject to proxy solicitation rules, or that the Department of Justice is going to come in and say you're colluding on price. So we would want there to be safety zones for shareholders to do that kind of work. And finally, we would want to adjust sort of tax rules, accounting rules, to make it clear that compensation based on profit alone is disfavored. That again, if you're a money manager, if you're in the C-suite at a company, simply achieving profit without doing it within these guardrails that make sure that you're not exploiting common resources and vulnerable populations, that that's off the table, that you're only rewarded for profit from the good stuff. So that, in a nutshell, is what we're looking for. Again, we have our own report that's referred to in the ASBC report. It's called "From Shareholder Primacy to Stakeholder Capitalism," and that has all the details.
And Rick, thank you so much for that. And maybe when you have a chance, you can put the URL for that report in the chat so people can access it if they're interested in diving in deeper to the work that you've been doing. Let me bring Tensie Whelan up next. Tensie?
Great. Thanks, Jeffrey. And I want to thank you for taking the leadership on this and really helping to put a proactive, positive perspective from business in terms of what we want and what kind of platform we believe in moving forward. So thanks for hurting all of us cats. And also many thanks to my panelists. So I know we're really active in the development of this report. So, I think what is really, one, and we've all talked about this, but one of the things that's really important and necessary for this country at this moment in time is that we focus on designing the world that we want to have and what business role in it is, what investors, what corporates, as well as the rest of society can do to take us there. And so in this report, we, on the environmental side, and as Jeffrey said, this is intersectional, but we looked at issues such as a green and resilient infrastructure, circular economy, moving to a low carbon transition, or having a low carbon transition, and regenerative agriculture. And the group looked at a variety of different areas where public policy can support business investment in shifting how we do our business, which ultimately has the most negative and potentially positive impact. So one area is under the green and resilient infrastructure is around green buildings. Buildings are a significant emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. Also, when you look at it from a health and well-being perspective, how those buildings are set up also have a significant impact on the people working and living there. So there we would like to see legislation along the lines of the New York City Climate Mobilization Act that supports energy retrofitting and other efforts. We also encourage federal and local governments to model this through making these changes in their own buildings and through their government-owned public housing. Water, another critical issue. We've seen the impact on populations around this country and disproportionately on people of color and low-income communities. So there we believe we really need to invest more, increase the amount of money going into the revolving, the drinking water funds at the state and federal level. Triple that funding to improve the infrastructure and clean water availability. And also look at creating potentially a new Clean Water for All initiative to ensure that everybody has access to clean drinking water. Transportation, the federal, and goes back to the design, we're subsidizing, supporting things that create negative externalities for all of us, as opposed to subsidizing, supporting those things that actually can help make our society better. So if you look at where we're subsidizing in terms of transport, we're subsidizing our highway system, our cars, as opposed to public transportation, and also as opposed to creating more resiliency in our infrastructure to deal with the impacts of climate change. So we have a significant focus on, federal investment in zero emission vehicle infrastructure, manufacturing, as well as clean, affordable, and accessible public transport. And also, another area around infrastructure is supporting local economic and workforce development and providing local jobs through dealing with polluted sites through remediation, et cetera, and helping people make transition from dirty and polluting industries into cleaner industries and opportunities. And finally, for this whole section, and this is true across everything, but that prioritizing environmental justice, issues in communities and really supporting them as some of the communities most disproportionately affected by the lack of infrastructure or from negative externalities. Supporting a low carbon transition, there we have recommended that we put a price on carbon, which would impose a carbon fee on fossil fuels and other greenhouse gases at the point where they first enter the economy. And we're suggesting that the funds from that go back to American households in the form of an annual dividend, so that you don't negatively impact people with lower income. We need to advance 100% shift to a shift to 100% renewables. And there's a variety of different ways that we recommend to do that, as well as fossil fuel divestment, government, state, and private sector, which we already see beginning to happen in both pension funds and with other financial institutions. I'm sure we'll hear more about that from Erika. And then regenerative agriculture, another area that is really critical. When you look at agriculture, huge greenhouse gas emission, pollution, water use, uses 60% of the world's water, biodiversity loss, and as well, really, in many cases, problematic labor conditions. So there we're saying we should really support farmer efforts to move to more regenerative agriculture that protects the soil. We're losing all of our topsoils. We're losing that productivity. It supports through ecosystem service payments, the sequestration of carbon in well-managed regenerative farms. We're also, again, the subsidies all go to the biggest companies, the biggest agri companies, and we don't support the smaller scale operations, which also leads to resiliency challenges, as we've seen both in terms of environmental impacts on those monoculture farms, but also in terms of resiliency around COVID and our supply chains being sort of optimized for efficiency as opposed to resiliency. And then finally on the circular economy, there we really encourage support of circular packaging to deal with single-use plastics and other packaging products we have, and we support the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, which requires, again, this goes back to design and how you tackle this stuff. It requires the manufacturers of those products with that packaging be responsible for the end of life disposal of it. And we've seen, for example, in Europe, just taking a bigger picture, looking at automotives, when companies there are required to deal with the end of life of those vehicles, they've set up a whole system for reusing and recycling those cars, whereas here they're just going into junkyards or being left on the side of the road. So, really significant opportunities there. And the other area was around advancing safer chemicals and products with along the EU legislation route. So just a couple of additional points. So that's the platform. The work that we're doing at Stern Center for Sustainable Business, we're seeing that a lot of these, these are not nice to have, they're must have. They're must have for society, but they're actually also a must have for business, because actually when we looked at automotive companies and them doing the end of life recycling, we saw one company netting $100 million in Europe as a result of that, because they were reusing 2.5% of the product and selling 10% of the product. We see really positive financial benefits accrue to companies that do invest in redesigning their business to account for and manage for these natural resource intensive activities. And one final thought in that is, if you think about pollution, which is big challenge with all of this, is that you're buying more of what you need to pay to dispose of what you're not using, right? It's a fundamental operational inefficiency that regulation can help. And even though corporates will often complain about that, actually in the end, we've seen that the Cleaner Act and a variety of other things have actually been beneficial to business in terms of their costs, as well as beneficial to the rest of us. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Jeff. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Tensie. That was terrific. We'll now turn to Erika Karp, who's up next. Erika?
So everything that we're all talking about here is, it's so critical. Jeffrey used the word indifference when we were talking. And I have to tell you, that's one of the things that makes me most angry. And the reason it makes me most angry is because we're not going to get to where we want to go in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals or all of the things that we can do to invest for racial equity, to invest for climate change, to invest for any kind of social justice, for water, education. We're not going to get there with indifference. And in fact, it reminds me, there's a quote from, I think, Benjamin Franklin. And he said that we will not have justice until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. And so the good part for me at Cornerstone, I get to work with individuals and families and foundations who are outraged about what's going on. And one of the things we also, Rick mentioned, Adam Smith and, and the wealth of nations, but people sometimes don't know that if you go further, Adam Smith wrote about the theory of moral sentiments. And he said that humans have an exquisite interest in the welfare of others. He was a good guy, not a bad guy. And by the way, even Milton Friedman, all right, who we have a lot to blame on, but Milton Friedman talked about a minimum wage, minimum livable wage. He understood that kind of getting closer to income equality or a livable wage was positive for economic growth, right? So all the economists know, all the rabbis know, and the quote from both, you could say it's a rabbi, you can say it's an economist. The reality is the principles, whether it's faith-based investing or impact investing, sustainable investing, these are the same principles. And so just by virtue of definition, all right, ESG is not an asset class, it is not a style, it is not an investment strategy. ESG analysis is a discipline. All right, to really look at the material, environmental, social, and governance factors that you need to look at for an appropriate risk-adjusted reward analysis. ESG analysis, this discipline, can get us to impact investing or to social, socially responsible investing or double bottom line, triple bottom line, whatever you want to call it. It is a discipline, okay? And here's a cool thing. I posted this note. You need to sacrifice nothing in terms of profit returns, market rate returns, by using ESG integration. The empirical evidence is unequivocal. So not only do you sacrifice nothing except indifference, but you actually can get outperformance if a manager is very skilled. And when I say a manager, an asset manager who is investing for our clients, and it is either about broad sustainability or it's about particular themes. And by the way, the fiduciary issue that Rick mentioned, the old debate that we're breaking a fiduciary duty if we use ESG analysis is not only dead wrong, but it's actually the opposite of that. You know, it is breaking fiduciary duty to not look at these critical factors that are material to economic outcomes. So we have to get rid of that myth. We have to get rid of the myth of underperformance. We have to get our language in order. And then we have to continue to serve our clients really well and show them market rate returns and social impact. And we can do all of these things. And the word just, we've all mentioned it, okay? We're not only talking about a just transition from climate action, right, as we move forward. We're talking about a number of transitions going on right now. We're in a digital transformation. We're in a communication, education, healthcare. All the trends that we were seeing pre-COVID are accelerating, right? And so as investors, we need to look for organizations that integrate ESG, right? That understand the long-term game, that understand innovation and creativity, and ultimately resilience. Again, those trends have accelerated now. And so, you know, I hate that expression, new normal, but the reality is we don't know what the normal is yet. We're in a healthcare crisis, a racial crisis, an economic crisis. Thankfully, we're not in a financial crisis, meaning the financial systems are working. So we need people to invest so they can sleep at night. Know that at the very least, you're not doing damage. And at the very best, you're doing both profitability and purpose. And so that's why I'm all excited about my job. Back to you, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Erika. MaryAnne, you're up now. Take it away, MaryAnne. But unmute yourself so we can hear your wisdom.
I'm excited to join this conversation today. What a powerful group. And I know that our audience today includes the Social Venture Circle, as well as our SBC memberships. And I'm so proud of the progress that we're making and the impact that we're having. And I'll use the words of Alan Bromberger, who in a recent press release said that about our partnership will create the United States leading socially responsible business group and unite top US entrepreneurs and leaders of mission-driven companies and common cause while amplifying and extending the collective voice of the sustainable business community in previously impossible ways. Alan, thank you so much for giving that shout out to this organization and all the incredible people who are doing remarkable work on the front lines in the US and now impacting businesses and communities around the world, to be truthfully honest. And especially in this moment. 2020 is the year of the largest civil rights movement in history of the world. The single largest civil rights movement in the history of the world in 2020, centered around human rights and inspired by Black Lives Matter. So one of the things that is crystal clear is that there is a calling, a demand, a mandate that all of the work that we're doing be centered around in an economy that works for all, that works to eradicate systemic racism. And one of the things that I'm most proud of in working on this proposal with this group is that, and as you read through the document, you will see that woven within the DNA of every single aspect of this proposal was with a lens of inclusion to make sure that no one was being left out in the consideration of everything related to infrastructure and that Tensie was describing and what Fredrick was describing, everything was through that lens. But when we get to the specifics of the work around how do we begin to repair the damage done. And we were having a conversation amongst our group, our race and equity working group, around the word repair, because when we say reparations, a lot of people don't think about it through the lens of, well, what is the root word of that? Because repair has to be done before we can restore, before we can regenerate. There's some work that needs to get done. And so one of the things that we focus on in our document, in our proposal, is around the work of reparations. And what does that mean? Well, one of the things, is education. We need to focus on, the pathway to creating an equitable opportunity for advancement, an equitable opportunity for home ownership, equitable opportunities for owning businesses. And there are certain fundamentals to that foundation. And one of them is education. So how do we go about beginning to do the work to provide not only equity in education in our public school system, but also in what is being taught in the schools, with respect for culture, respect for sacred sites, respect for the actual true history of what the Black American contribution has been to this land, to this country that's been built upon the backs and the intellectual property and the genius of Black people. All of that has to be taken into consideration. And so besides education, there's also, how is the government, what is their role in working with, developing a fairer level playing field when it comes to opportunities for businesses, business startups, business investment, business growth. We need to, reparations focuses on how do we, think about legislation that impacts the opportunity for, land ownership, home ownership, education, all of these factors that contribute to the, to creating a new economy that really does work for all. And we don't have all the answers. These are conversations that we need to have, and therefore we need a commission. We need a group of people who are focused and dedicated on understanding this work, doing the deep history, and can bring intelligence, ideas, and solutions. And so one of the things that we talk about in our proposal is that we're in support of this commission, because when we ask this question to, and I've had an opportunity to talk with graduate law students across the country, and I've talked to civic groups, and I've talked to community leaders. And when we talk about reparations, because the redress is so deep and it's so massive that it's so difficult to come up with any one solution that everyone agrees on. So there needs to be work to wrap our heads around how do we even begin to tackle this? How do we prioritize? What should come first? And it's not just for Black African Americans, it's also for Native communities. So there's something called the Honoring Promises to Native Nations Act, which addresses the chronic underfunding and barriers to sovereignty in Indian country and holds federal government accountable for honoring America's legal promises. And so, we're in support of doing that work, and how do we begin to redress and honor and pay back the Native Americans who are responsible for giving us this land. While we're talking about this, I want to encourage everyone, if you have not yet had the opportunity, there is a film that's called Gather, and it's produced by Sanjay Rawal. And it's a story of indigenous agriculture and food sovereignty, and focuses on the Apache Nation, and the Dakotas, and the Akanebe up on the East Coast, and what they have, how they have not only taken care of the land until the colonists came and took it over, but it also talks about what their history has been and how these communities are rebuilding and reconnecting. And it's a history lesson that we all need to understand about our Native American brothers and sisters who took care of this land before we got here, and we owe them. And then another area of focus for the proposal is the Americans with disabilities. And so we're focusing on working with Senator Tammy Duckworth on the Disabled Access Credit Expansion Act that strengthens the ADA, especially for owners, disabled business enterprises, but also for the disability community in general, which has, especially during this current administration, really suffered huge setbacks in their health and well-being. And one of the things that is mind-numbing for me when I think about how we treat people with disabilities is that it's so counterintuitive to repress a group of people and just, you know, have them dependent upon a social services system, when we know that as taxpayers, one of the last things that most people really want to support are social services. It's like it's a stigma. When conversely, if we instead invited people with disabilities to become part of society and become employed and be able to contribute, not only does it give them dignity, but then they can also be a taxpayer citizen and reduce the need for social services. It's so counterintuitive to not do that. So one of the things that we're also working on is trying to help people find a way to be more welcomed into the workforce, which goes into our high road business practices and when it comes to diversity. So the Race and Equity Working Group, working with ASBC, focuses on the high road business practices that include more diversity in the workforce, more that not only training, not only retention and hiring and benefits, but also leadership. And that means board roles. And that means allowing them to have a voice at the table where they're actually leading the work. Because when you really think about it, who's best to lead the work but the people who have been the most, you know, on the end of the spectrum where they have, you know, been the victims of poor business practices. So the work is extensive. It's going to take a long time because it took us 450 years to get here. But we feel like this proposal is an excellent start, an excellent foundation. We invite all of you to read it, engage in it, ask questions, probe, challenge us, be a part of this, because it really is, all of us are in this together and we're only stronger together. Thank you.
Thank you, MaryAnne. That was wonderful. And we're going to turn now to some of the questions that have been asked while we've been chatting. So thank you all for asking questions. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, not in the chat, I'm sorry, please put them in the Q&A. So one question that came in was, aren't we in a political crisis today? And for this to happen, doesn't government need to be a partner of ours? And I would say absolutely. We can't do this without tremendous interaction with the government and elected officials, not just at the federal level, but also at the state level. And we, ASBC, produced a guide for how to work at a more local level as well as at a federal level. One of the things that we've done in this report is we've identified where they exist, legislative solutions, proposals that have already been brought forward by legislators. And we certainly need a government that wants to interact with us. And one of the things that ASBC does is bring leaders from business to Washington and state capitals to make the business case of why these changes are actually good for the economy. And it's not about a trade-off to make things weaker, but these proposals will build a stronger and more resilient economy. I want to turn to another question that I'd like to ask all the panelists to perhaps briefly address. One of the things that we get in terms of feedback to this report is people saying, well, you have all these companies today talking about sustainability and corporate responsibility and launching all of these sustainability initiatives. They believe they can solve this problem on their own. Why do we need regulations and legislation to bring about the changes that we're talking about? So Rick, do you want to just touch on that briefly?
Oh, sure. Briefly will be hard, but there's a lot of ways to sort of address that. But one thing I would say is, and I don't want to denigrate the work, right? It's great if a company lowers its carbon output or, does something, that helps to restore some sort of balance, whether with inequality or racial justice or other things. But largely that work is being done in what Bill Bally calls a context-free basis, where it's great to know that you reduced your carbon, but the real question is whether you are, within a science-based target for a Paris-compliant world, or whether your human rights practices are sufficient, where if everybody else was engaging in the same practice, we would address the human rights crisis around the world. And that's really what we're trying to do, is create a situation where shareholders can work together to make sure that everybody's hewing to that same rule, because otherwise you get kind of a prisoner's dilemma with what I was talking about at the beginning, which is that people still, at the end of the day, they're still seeing that bottom line. And so if companies are individually trying to work toward getting better, that's not necessarily going to address the issue where they can do well by doing bad, which unfortunately sometimes is possible.
Thank you, Rick. Another question that I'll ask Tensie and Erika to address. We have practice what is known as unbridled capitalism. And we're talking about developing a new ideology about the way we practice capitalism. How do we make that transition from the obsession with profits and earnings per share to the kind of capitalism that really works for all people?
So what I would say is that, there are a lot of mechanisms that people are toying with. For instance, a long-term stock exchange, things like that. What I think we need to move towards, and by the way, to the question before, you absolutely need a good regulatory structure, right? And think of that as infrastructure, building infrastructure. That's governance, right? What I would say is that the corporates have led the investors, who have led the public sector in terms of driving sustainability, right? But I think one of the single most important things, again, governance comes first, right? Because if a company is not looking at the environmental and social issues that faces it, then it's bad governance by definition, all right? So in any case, one of the things that I think is most important is transparency. So clearly, when it comes to ESG data, we're still in the early stages. It is not enough quality around the data to use it, predictably, to use it for comparisons, to use it for, models. That said, we are making progress, and there's organizations like the SASB and like the GRI. And if we get the transparency we need, we'll really start to understand which corporations are talking about sustainability and which are doing it. What are the values of an organization? Are they aligned with those of our investors? So to answer the question, again, I think that the magnitude, the corpus of capital that we need to move is huge. We need catalytic capital from the asset owners. We need good regulatory structures from the government, and we need real transparency into corporate sustainability. So we know when it's, window dressing, and we know when it's real. And by the way, I apologize because I have a hard stop in about 2 minutes, so I'm going to drop off from everybody.
Okay. Tensie, your thoughts on this subject?
Yeah, so I mean, if we look at this from a historical perspective, this form of capitalism has only been with us for the last, 40 to 50 years. It isn't that we always drove decisions based on short-term management of stock price, right? And I think as well, if you look at, there's this great book called Cheap that looks at, for example, products and how we've all been socialized in the last 50 years to focus only almost exclusively on price when we purchase products, which then leads to a lot of knock-on negative effects. Before the 50s, we focused on durability, artisanship, as well as price. Price is always an issue for us, but there were a series of other factors that were much more forward in our thinking. And because of sort of a variety of different issues, we've, again, socialized ourselves into thinking about this from, how can I get as much stuff as possible, as cheaply as possible. So I think what's happening is, we're in the midst of a massive change, and a lot of the negative, horrible stuff we're dealing with is sort of the reaction of the dinosaur dying and its tail flying around and, doing a lot of horrible things while it's dying. But I think, hopefully we'll look back on this in 20 years and see that indeed we're in the middle of a robust change. You see consumers changing, you see employees changing what they want, you see, the dialogue around what regulators' role should be, all changing really rapidly with enormous amount of inertia and actually negative pushing back on that, not to minimize that at all. And just as an aside to the previous question around government role and so on, I think one of the big challenges we have is that businesses have set up their lobbying arms to basically focus on getting us whatever they can for their company, even when you have companies with very strong sustainability commitments and strategies. So we need companies like that are involved in this endeavor to break that mold and to start lobbying for societal-wide and industry-wide support that will help us all move this agenda forward faster.
Thank you, Tensie. Next question that Michael Friedman asks is a two-part question. I'll address the first one, and I'm going to ask MaryAnne to address the second part of the question. But one question is, what's the role of worker ownership in this kind of transition to building economic equality? And I would say huge. I would say that one of the key ways in which we can capture value and wealth and distribute it more broadly is through employee ownership. And I would say that that should be foundational to the way any company practices sustainability or corporate responsibility. In our proposal, we talk about worker ownership, and we talk about ways in which to increase and encourage worker ownership through tax incentives and other tactics that make it more attractive for companies to use on a much more broad scale effort. And for MaryAnne, there's a question about active participatory civil society. How do we create a civil society with much more active participation to help bring about these types of changes? And you're on mute, MaryAnne.
Yeah, so that's really an excellent question, and it's fundamental and critical and key. One of the things that I think has been, and it's all part of the challenge in front of us that's been created by systemic racism, is not being included. Our voices not being heard, not being able to be at the table to engage in the conversation, not being at the table when the decisions are made. So I think that, and at this juncture, because I think that what is also gaping is trust. There's no trust because the relationship has not between disenfranchised or marginalized populations and I'll refer to them as colonialists, or the people that have been, you know, in charge of marshaling efforts of where the growth of this country or where it's been going. There's this rift. So and there's no trust. So what has to happen? The engagement has to be started from the folks who are in charge. I directly challenge in my conversations white men, because white men are in control. White men have the power. So in the ways that we're going to be able to, I think, begin to build trust is to find ways to engage in conversation and outreach, and to bring people to the table to participate in the conversation about our future together. And so that means going into communities. That means, you know, making sure that you're identifying and talking with and empowering leaders in the community on the legislative level, within your educational system, which is, you know, I'm in a state where our education system is failing miserably. And then one of the reasons why, and I watch it happen over and over again, is because you have the business community so far removed from what's going on in the educational community, yet that's where our workforce gets developed. But there's not a mutual support system going on. So there needs to be more engagement, for example, from the business community, that needs to be able to be more supportive and take ownership of investment in education. There needs to be a new contract that's made with within, you know, the financial institutions, where they're providing more access to capital so that businesses can find a way, or have a resource to be able to get started. And it's not just access to capital, it's also access to resources, access to counsel and consultation and how to get those businesses growing. So I think, so there's the relationships need to be need to be nurtured and developed and made available throughout every single facet of not only industry, but also in different demographies. And that's going to take, each one reach one kind of approach. Every opportunity in front of you as an individual, if you can in your community, get engaged, identify those organizations on the ground that are on the front lines that are doing the work, invest in them. Please write a check. If somebody in your neighborhood is running for office as a person of color, give to their campaign. If if there's a historically Black college or university in your area, give it money. Go volunteer, do something. So in other words, at this point, it's on us to take that first step. You need to get educated, you need to get engaged, you need to stop sitting back and we're not coming to your door, because that's our experience has not been that the door is going to be open. So I think that the people that have the power, who are in charge, white people, need to step up, lean in, and start to become more active in their communities in that way. And that's the only way this is really going to change.
Thank you, MaryAnne, for those words. Sadly, we're out of time. I know we didn't get to all of the participants' questions. This is certainly a topic that people are passionate and interested in. We would encourage you to make sure you download the report from the ASBC website and send us your comments and thoughts. As MaryAnne said, this is a living document. We'll be making additions, we'll be making changes. So we'd love to engage with you in this dialogue. So thanks again to our incredible panel who participated today. And thanks so much to you participants who spent an hour of your time with us on this most important topic. And with that, onward, upward, we will not stop fighting until our work is done, and look forward to working with all of you on these important issues. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.